The Spark and the Gathering Storm. The year was 1861. The United States stood on a knife's edge, split into by irreconcilable visions of what the nation was meant to be. And then came Fort Sumter. In April, in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, the long season of political maneuvering came to an end in fire and thunder. Confederate cannons opened up on the Federal garrison, shattering the illusion that words, compromises, and parchment might yet hold the nation together. The fort's surrender was small in tactical terms, but symbolically, it was a detonation heard across the continent. Any lingering hope of peaceful reconciliation vanished in that smoke. The currency of debate was no longer persuasion, but violence. The bullet, the bayonet, and the cannon shell would now decide the fate of the Republic. From that moment, ordinary men and women understood their future had been wrenched from the hands of politicians in Washington and Richmond and placed instead into the calloused grip of soldiers in blue and gray. America was preparing to do battle not with a foreign enemy, but with itself. And at stake was nothing less than the survival of the United States. A fever of patriotism. Letters began to pour across the land, betraying a fever of restlessness and patriotic fervor. Dear brother, they are volunteering right smartly here. If you want to join a company, come down here and let's go together. I can't sleep. I can't study. If a fellow wants to court a girl now, had best enlist. In the South, the call to arms was cloaked in romantic ideals. War was not imagined as a grinding contest of factories and railroads, but as a chivalric enterprise and echo of the knights of old. Youths crowded into recruiting offices, eager to don uniforms, to ride out beneath banners, to prove themselves in defense of their homeland. A wave of nationalism swept the states of Dixie, intoxicating, heady, blinding. They had seceded, they declared, and formed their own sovereign republic. They would defend it, sword in hand, against what they saw as northern tyranny. Few stopped to consider the grim arithmetic of industrial war, that foundries, shipyards, and standardized rail lines might matter more than gallantry. That victory would be measured in tons of steel, in miles of track, in rivers controlled, not in the lofty ideals of romance. The South marched with confidence toward a furnace it could scarcely imagine. The North awakens. In the North, the mood was one of outraged fury sharpened by the insult of Sumter. How dare they secede? How dare they fire upon the flag? Even moderates who had wavered now found themselves resolved. This was not mere rebellion. It was treason, an act of sacrilege against the civic religion of the United States. From Boston to Chicago, volunteers thronged enlistment offices. Patriotism surged in the streets. Songs rang out. Local militias swelled into regiments. Men who only weeks before had argued for peace now demanded war. Treason, in the common imagination, could only be answered with death. And so the North armed itself for the reckoning to come. The domino of states. In Richmond, Montgomery, and across the South, the Confederacy expanded. For new states North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, and Arkansas joined the cause. These were not marginal additions. They brought nearly a third of the manpower of the Confederate armies and vast stores of food. Most vital of all was Virginia, straddling the Potomac itself, breathing down upon Washington. Yet even here, loyalties fractured. In the rugged western mountains of Virginia, Unionist sentiment ran strong. Thousands enlisted beneath the stars and stripes. By 1863, that western half would break away entirely, becoming the new state of West Virginia a living testament to the divisions tearing the land apart. In Tennessee, too, Union regiments quietly formed in the shadow of Confederate banners. Maryland posed an especially delicate problem. Without it, Washington, D.C. would be isolated. Lincoln acted swiftly, flooding the state with federal troops, ensuring that secession could not succeed. Maryland remained in the Union uneasily, tensely, yet decisively. The question of loyalty. For many Southerners, the question of allegiance was agonizing. Was one's loyalty owed to the Union or to one's home state? For Robert E. Lee, the dilemma was excruciating. He was no secessionist, no firebrand. When offered command of the Union armies themselves, he hesitated. But when Virginia seceded, he declared, "I cannot raise my sword against my native state." And so he resigned his commission and took up arms for the South. Lee was not alone. Many of the most gifted officers of the United States Army, men seasoned in Mexico, men who had studied strategy at West Point, resigned to join the Confederacy. Even Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, had been a distinguished soldier and Secretary of War. By contrast, the Union's new commander-in-chief, Abraham Lincoln, had no such pedigree. His military experience amounted to a handful of weeks in the Black Hawk War, chasing shadows on the frontier. He joked that he had fought more mosquitoes than men. But Lincoln had something else: resolve, a sense of purpose, and a determination to harness the North's vast resources into an engine of war. Raising armies. Both sides scrambled to raise forces. Militias were the foundation. Recruiting offices sprouted in towns and villages. Bounties were offered. Yet the widespread belief, laughable in hindsight, was that the war would be over in 90 days. Few imagined years of blood and sacrifice. So men signed up for 3-month terms, convinced they would be home by harvest, cheered as victors, celebrated as heroes. This illusion of a short war colored everything. Each side assumed it was superior. Each believed it would win in a single decisive clash. Aims of war. The aims of the two sides diverged profoundly. For the South, the war was defensive. It did not need to conquer the North, it merely needed to avoid conquest itself. Jefferson Davis declared, "All we ask is to be let alone." The North, however, faced a far harder challenge. To preserve the Union, it would have to subdue the South entirely, an immense undertaking across thousands of miles against determined foes. Yet public opinion in the North clamored for a quick, glorious triumph. Newspapers demanded revenge. "Forward to Richmond," they cried, urging the army to crush the rebellion in a single stroke. The road to Bull Run. The first casualty of note came in May. Colonel Elmer Ellsworth, a close friend of Lincoln, was shot while tearing down a Confederate flag in Alexandria, Virginia. His death made him a martyr in Northern eyes, fanning the flames of vengeance still higher. By summer, the stage was set. Both armies gathered near the town of Manassas, Virginia, astride key railroads. To the north, the coming battle would be remembered as Bull Run. To the south, it would forever be Manassas. Spectators, congressmen, townsfolk, even families with picnic baskets flocked to watch, believing it would be a spectacle, a swift and decisive clash to end the matter. They were about to be disabused of that illusion. The long march into the fire had begun. Baptism of fire. The summer sun of July 1861 burned down upon Virginia. Fields of wheat shimmered. Cicadas shrieked in the heat. And there, near a quiet stream called Bull Run, two untested armies prepared to decide the fate of a continent. For 3 strange months after Fort Sumter, the nation had been at war in name but not in fact. Men had drilled, politicians had thundered, families had watched nervously, but no great battle had yet been fought. That wait ended now. The Confederate capital had shifted northward from Montgomery to Richmond, drawing its lines closer to Washington, D.C. And at Manassas Junction, just 30 miles from the Union capital, two great railroads intersected vital arteries of war. Both sides knew its value. Both sides marched to claim it. The Battle of Bull Run on July 21st, the Army of Northeastern Virginia, commanded by Union General Irvin McDowell, advanced across the Bull Run stream. The Federals struck hard and early. By mid-morning, Confederate lines were buckling. Dust choked the fields as men broke and fled. Union soldiers cried out in triumph, "The South is beaten. The war is over." But the war had only begun. At the center of the Confederate line stood a Virginia brigade led by a stern professor turned soldier, Thomas Jonathan Jackson. Calm amid chaos, he rallied his men with iron resolve. Another general pointed to him and shouted, "Look, men, there is Jackson, standing like a stone wall." The word stuck. In that crucible, Stonewall Jackson was born. His brigade held fast, unyielding as granite, while fresh Confederate reinforcements poured onto the field from the Shenandoah Valley. By late afternoon, the tide had turned. General Beauregard, sensing the moment, unleashed a thunderous counterattack. Confederate troops surged forward, bayonets flashing in the smoke. The Union line shattered. What had begun as a promising advance collapsed into panic. Soldiers fled in confusion. Wagons jammed the roads. Civilians, those picnickers who had come to witness a glorious spectacle, were swept up in the rout, congressmen and ladies alike galloping in terror alongside broken soldiers. The retreat became infamous as the Great Skedaddle. Shock and disbelief. Washington itself lay vulnerable, defenseless. Yet the Confederate army, elated but disorganized, failed to pursue. Victory had stunned them almost as much as it had the North. One general later admitted that the Southerners seemed more disorganized by their victory than the Federals by their defeat. Even Jefferson Davis, riding among the chaos, struggled to tell whether he was gazing upon triumph or disaster. Still, the result was undeniable. The South had won. The first great battle of the Civil War had ended in Confederate glory. Nearly 4,500 men lay dead, wounded, or captured, and the nation understood, at last, what had been unleashed. This war would not end in a single clash. It would be long. It would be brutal. Reckonings in Washington and Richmond. In Washington, recriminations fell swiftly. General McDowell, humiliated, was replaced by a rising star, George B. McClellan, a dashing, self-assured officer who promised to rebuild the Union Army into a disciplined, professional machine. His arrival electrified the North. In Richmond, debate raged. Should the victorious Confederates press forward and seize Washington? Some urged immediate assault. Others counseled patience. Ultimately, caution prevailed. The Confederacy clung to its guiding principle: theirs was a defensive war. All we want is to be left alone. But the truth was clearer now than ever. Neither side would collapse quickly. The war would demand rivers of blood. The war at sea. While armies were grouped on land, a new theater of war emerged along the coastlines and rivers. President Lincoln had proclaimed a blockade of the South, seeking to choke its lifelines of cotton and supplies. At first, it was derided as a paper blockade, porous and ineffective. Smugglers' blockade runners slipped through with ease. European observers scoffed. But gradually, the Union Navy tightened its grip. Ports fell: Hatteras in North Carolina, Ship Island in the Gulf, Port Royal in South Carolina. Each new foothold was a vice on the Confederacy's economy, squeezing ever tighter. Yet this blockade carried dangerous political consequences. Lincoln insisted the war was a domestic rebellion, not a conflict between nations. But if that were so, how could he justify blockading his own people? In the courts of Europe, critics argued, if the United States wished the blockade recognized under international law, then it must also admit the Confederacy was a legitimate belligerent. Thus, paradoxically, the very blockade that threatened to strangle the South risked granting it recognition abroad. The clash of ironclads. Amid this maritime chess game, a revolution in naval warfare erupted. The age of wooden warships was dying. At Norfolk, Virginia, Confederate engineers took the burned-out hull of the USS Merrimac and encased it in iron. The result was a monstrous, angular beast christened the CSS Virginia. With 10 heavy guns and a massive iron ram, she was a floating fortress, clumsy but devastating. In March 1862, the Virginia steamed into Hampton Roads. Union wooden ships crumbled before her. The Cumberland was rammed and sunk. The Congress was set ablaze. Panic swept the fleet. The blockade itself seemed doomed. But the North had an answer: an experimental craft designed by Swedish engineer John Ericsson. Low to the waterline, with only a single revolving turret, it looked more like a raft with a cheese box than a warship. She was the USS Monitor, and she was unlike anything the world had seen. On March 9th, the two iron beasts met in battle. For hours, they pounded each other with shot and shell, sparks flying, iron ringing. Smoke blackened the sky. The clash ended in stalemate. The Virginia limped back to port. The Monitor held her ground. Yet the significance was unmistakable. The era of wooden navies was over. The world had witnessed the dawn of modern naval warfare. The industrial divide. The duel of ironclads underscored the deeper truth of the war. The North could innovate, experiment, and build anew. It had the foundries, the shipyards, the engineers. It could forge a Monitor. The South, by contrast, had scraps: one steel mill, limited resources, desperate improvisation. It could armor a hulk, bolt rails to a barge, craft a single ironclad. But it could not match the North's industrial tide. In the long war, this disparity would weigh heavily. Europe watches. Across the Atlantic, eyes were fixed on America. Britain, in particular, measured its options. The South supplied its textile mills with cotton. Recognition of the Confederacy would mean breaking the Union blockade, intervening in the war. Yet British leaders hesitated. Could the Confederacy truly stand? Was this rebellion a viable nation or a doomed insurrection? The answer would depend on the coming campaigns. Victories might win the South recognition. Defeats could seal its isolation. Thus, in the winter of 1861, and the spring of 1862, the war teetered not only on the fields and rivers of America, but in the drawing rooms of London and Paris. Toward a new phase. By early 1862, both sides were hardening. The smoke of Bull Run had cleared. The shock of ironclads had echoed across the seas. Now, the war moved inland again. Rivers and fortresses would be the next prizes. And from the west, a new figure was rising, quiet, unassuming, but relentless. His name was Ulysses S. Grant. He would soon reshape the struggle and drench it in blood. The anvil of the West. The rivers of America's heartland, the Tennessee, the Cumberland, the Mississippi, were more than lines on a map. They were highways cutting through forests, mountains, and farmlands, carrying trade, soldiers, and supplies. Whoever controlled the rivers would control the spine of the Confederacy. And in the winter of 1862, a little-known Union general set his sights on them. His name was Ulysses S. Grant, the man no one expected. When the war began, Grant was a clerk in his father's leather goods store in Galena, Illinois. He was quiet, modest, with stooped shoulders and a rough beard. He did not cut the figure of a conqueror. His earlier military career had ended in resignation, dogged by rumors of drink and failure. Yet war has a way of finding the men it needs. Grant returned to the Army in 1861 and quickly displayed a rare quality. He acted. Where others hesitated, he struck. Where others waited for orders, he created opportunity. By late 1861, Grant commanded Union forces in southern Illinois and western Kentucky. His eyes turned southward to the Confederate forts guarding the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. If those gateways could be taken, the Union would pierce deep into Tennessee, severing Confederate supply lines and cracking open the lower South. Fort Henry, the first blow. In February 1862, Grant moved. With the support of Naval Commander Andrew H. Foote, he marched his army toward Fort Henry, a Confederate stronghold on the Tennessee River. The fort's position was poorly chosen. Built on low ground, it was vulnerable to rising water. As Union gunboats steamed into range, the Tennessee swelled, flooding Confederate defenses. The defenders, under General Lloyd Tillman, fought bravely but hopelessly. After a brief bombardment, Tillman surrendered his small garrison. Union forces surged into the fort, raising the stars and stripes over its battered ramparts. It was a modest victory, but symbolic. The Union had cracked open the Confederacy's river defenses. Fort Donelson, baptism of ice and fire. But the true test lay just 12 miles east at Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. Larger, stronger, and better defended, Donelson bristled with heavy guns. Here, the Confederacy meant to stand. Grant wasted no time. In bitter cold, with snow driving across the Tennessee hills, he laid siege to the fort. Union troops shivered in thin coats, building crude shelters, gnawing on hardtack. Confederate defenders, commanded by Generals Floyd, Pillow, and Buckner, hunkered down behind frozen earthworks. On February 13th, the Union Army attacked. Foote's ironclads joined in, pounding the fort from the river. But Confederate fire tore into the Union fleet. Foote himself was wounded. The gunboats pulled back, battered and smoking. The next day, Confederate forces struck back in a desperate bid to break the siege. At dawn, Southern soldiers surged from their trenches, crashing into Union lines. Muskets thundered, bayonets clashed. Hours passed in savage fighting. The Union right wing faltered. Retreat loomed. Then Grant arrived from the rear. He had been inspecting other positions, but now, seeing his men shaken, he spoke with calm clarity. The enemy has tried to cut their way out and are not going to succeed. The way is open for us. We will advance at once. The words rippled through the ranks like fire. Union soldiers reformed, counterattacked, and drove the Confederates back. By nightfall, Donelson was surrounded once more. Unconditional surrender. That night, Confederate commanders quarreled. General Floyd slipped away with a portion of his troops. Pillow vanished soon after. The burden of surrender fell to General Simon Bolivar Buckner, once a close friend of Grant in peacetime. At dawn, Buckner sent a message asking Grant for terms. Grant's reply was terse, uncompromising, unforgettable. No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works. The words electrified the North. Newspapers hailed him as unconditional surrender Grant. For the first time, Union forces had captured a major Confederate army over 12,000 men. The impact was seismic. The Union controlled both the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. The heart of Tennessee lay exposed. The Confederacy's western line had shattered. The road to Shiloh. Grant's star rose swiftly, but with fame came scrutiny. In Washington, critics muttered about his habits, his supposed recklessness, his rumored drinking. Others doubted his competence. But Lincoln, watching closely, defended him. "I can't spare this man. He fights." And fight Grant would. By March, his army advanced deeper into Tennessee, camping near a small church named Shiloh Meeting House by the Tennessee River at Pittsburgh Landing. Here, he awaited reinforcements from General Don Carlos Buell. But the Confederates, under General Albert Sidney Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard, resolved to strike first. They gathered nearly 40,000 men and marched north. The Battle of Shiloh, Day 1. At dawn on April 6, 1862, as Union soldiers cooked breakfast in their camps, the woods erupted with musket fire. Confederate troops stormed forward, shrieking the rebel yell. Union camps collapsed in chaos. Men fled in terror. Tents burned. It was one of the most savage surprises in American history. Grant, miles downstream recovering from an injury, rushed to the field. Riding through retreating men, he calmly organized defenses. "Hold them, boys," he urged, pointing toward the river. All day, the Confederates pressed forward. Union lines bent, broke, reformed. By afternoon, Union forces were driven back toward Pittsburgh Landing. The Tennessee River at their backs, there was no escape. Yet still they held. Along the sunken road, later called the Hornet's Nest, Union troops fought like demons, repelling wave after wave until they were surrounded and captured. Their sacrifice bought precious hours. But the cost was horrific. Bodies piled in heaps. Blood mingled with mud. The screams of the wounded echoed through the forest. As evening fell, the Union army clung desperately to the riverbank. The Confederates had driven them nearly to destruction. But their own lines were exhausted, broken by the day's carnage. Then, fate struck. General Albert Sidney Johnston, the South's most promising commander, was mortally wounded in the leg, bleeding out on the battlefield. Command passed to Beauregard, who, believing victory secured, halted the assault. The Battle of Shiloh, Day 2. That night, rain poured in torrents. Soldiers lay shivering in the mud, beside the wounded and the dead. Grant, soaked and weary, refused to despair. Asked what he intended to do next, he answered simply, "Attack at daylight." At dawn on April 7th, Union reinforcements under Buell arrived. With fresh troops, the Union surged forward. The exhausted Confederates, outnumbered and leaderless, were driven back across the field they had won the day before. By afternoon, the Southern Army retreated, leaving Grant battered but victorious. The cost of Shiloh. Shiloh stunned the nation. Nearly 24,000 men had been killed, wounded, or missing more casualties than all previous American wars combined. The myth of a short, romantic war died at Shiloh. It was slaughter on an industrial scale, a foretaste of the agony to come. Northern critics howled. They called Grant reckless, accused him of negligence. Demands for his removal rose to a fever pitch. But Lincoln again stood firm. "I cannot spare this man. He fights." Grant remained. The Mississippi opens. Even as Shiloh raged, Union forces pressed the Confederacy on the rivers. Admiral David Farragut, commanding a fleet of wooden ships, dared to steam past the massive forts guarding New Orleans. Through fire and darkness, his fleet battered through. On April 25, 1862, New Orleans fell the Confederacy's largest city, its key port on the Gulf. Meanwhile, Union armies under General Henry Halleck advanced southward. Corinth, Memphis, and other strongholds fell. The upper Mississippi was nearly secured. The Confederate West was unraveling. The South under siege. For the Confederacy, these blows were staggering. Kentucky and most of Tennessee slipped from their grasp. The Mississippi, their great artery, was threatened from both ends. But the South did not collapse. It fought on with grim resolve. Leaders promised vengeance. New armies were raised. Guerrillas struck Union supply lines. And in Virginia, Robert E. Lee would soon emerge to lead a series of dazzling campaigns. The war had entered a new phase, bigger, bloodier, more desperate. The rivers run red. The Union victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson were not just tactical triumphs. They were thunderclaps that echoed far beyond Tennessee's frozen hills. These twin blows secured for the North vast swaths of Southern territory and, more critically, command of the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers, watery highways slicing deep into the Confederacy's heart. The North had found a way in. For Europe, watching closely from afar, the message was sobering. If Britain or France had toyed with the notion of intervening on behalf of the young Confederacy, these Union gains suggested caution. Perhaps the rebellion was not so indomitable after all. But victories come with their shadows. For if Donelson had burnished Ulysses S. Grant with the nickname Unconditional Surrender, it had also drawn him further south, into the maw of destiny. The stage was now set for one of the bloodiest episodes in the American Civil War, a clash so ferocious that it stripped away all illusions of a short, chivalrous conflict. It came on a Sunday morning, April 6, 1862, near a quiet backwoods chapel called Shiloh Meeting House. The name, taken from Hebrew, meant tranquility. Never had a place been so cruelly misnamed. At dawn, Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston unleashed 40,000 men upon the unsuspecting Union camps sprawled along the banks of the Tennessee River. Blue-coated soldiers, barely roused from their tents, were caught frying bacon, boiling coffee, joking in the soft spring light. What followed was not war as Americans had known it, but a storm of annihilation. One Union soldier recalled, their cannonade was like a mighty hurricane sweeping all before it. The Battle of Shiloh, or Pittsburgh Landing, as it was called in the Northie, had begun. The first day belonged to the Confederates. Johnston's army surged forward, wave after wave, driving Grant's men from their camps in chaos. At the Hornet's Nest, a desperate Union brigade made a stand, only to be encircled and blasted at near point-blank range by Confederate artillery. The air was alive with shrieking iron, the ground trembling under each thunderous volley. Yet their sacrifice bought precious hours. By nightfall, the Union army was pinned with its back to the Tennessee River. Defeat, even destruction, loomed. But fortune, and the river, saved Grant. Under cover of darkness, reinforcements arrived, ferried across by the Union Navy. Grant, calm in the storm, resolved not to retreat but to strike back. His words were simple, steady, "I shall attack at daylight." And so he did. At dawn on April 7th, with fresh troops swelling his battered ranks, Grant hurled the Union army forward. Confederate lines buckled. Exhaustion, casualties, and the sudden loss of Johnston himself, struck down by a bullet, left the Southern army reeling. By afternoon, they fell back toward Corinth, leaving the field and the dead to Grant. Shiloh was technically a Union victory, but a ghastly one. Nearly 24,000 men lay killed, wounded, or missing, more casualties in 2 days than America had suffered in all its previous wars combined. The battlefield was a nightmare. Torn bodies, shattered limbs, the screams of the dying. Surgeons worked frantically through the night, sawing arms and legs in bloody heaps. Wild pigs from the surrounding woods, it was whispered, gorged themselves on the fallen. The illusion of a quick war was dead. The nation had awakened to horror, fire, and shadow. The smoke of Shiloh still lingered when a new theater of war demanded attention. If the rivers of the West were the arteries of the Confederacy, then Richmond, the capital of the rebellion, was its beating heart. Capture it, Union leaders believed, and the war would end. The man chosen to deliver that prize was George Brinton McClellan, the young Napoleon. McClellan was everything Grant was not. A graduate near the top of his West Point class, he was polished, handsome, adored by his soldiers, and hailed in Northern newspapers as a military genius. His troops called him Little Mac and marched with swagger beneath his command. He drilled them relentlessly, molding a ragged mob into the Army of the Potomac, a force of near 100,000 men, the largest army yet assembled on the continent. McClellan believed in precision, in order, in preparation. But he also believed, fatally, that the enemy before him was always larger, always stronger. He magnified Confederate numbers in his reports until shadows became giants. His caution would haunt him and the nation. The Peninsular Gamble. In the spring of 1862, McClellan unveiled his grand design. Rather than march directly south, he would ferry his vast army by water to the Virginia Peninsula, between the York and James rivers. From there, he would march on Richmond from the east, bypassing the entrenched Confederate defenses of northern Virginia. It was a bold maneuver, elegant, even Napoleonic. By April, Union forces were entrenched at Yorktown. Yet McClellan hesitated. Reports of massive Confederate numbers, phantoms conjured by the skillful deception of General Joseph E. Johnston, convinced him to lay siege. For a month, his great army sat, digging trenches, hauling cannon, while the Confederates quietly withdrew. By May, McClellan finally advanced. At Seven Pines, his army clashed with Johnston's. The battle was inconclusive, but Johnston fell wounded. And into the vacuum rode a tall, austere Virginian with a piercing gaze and iron self-control, Robert Edward Lee. The rise of Robert E. Lee. Until then, Lee had been dismissed by some as overly cautious. But now, with Richmond threatened, he seized command of the Army of Northern Virginia and acted with daring. Where McClellan saw overwhelming numbers against him, Lee saw an opportunity to strike. In late June, Lee launched the 7 Days Battles. For a week, his army hurled itself at the Union forces, often suffering terrible losses. But Lee's aggressiveness unnerved McClellan. Each Confederate assault, though tactically costly, convinced McClellan that he was outnumbered, surrounded, on the verge of disaster. Finally, shaken and disillusioned, McClellan ordered retreat. His magnificent Peninsular Campaign, which had carried Union banners to within sight of Richmond's church spires, collapsed into withdrawal. Lee had saved the Confederate capital. More than that, he had seized the initiative. The war in the East would now dance to his rhythm. Second Bull Run. By midsummer 1862, Union morale sagged. McClellan's failure left Washington vulnerable again. President Lincoln, desperate, turned to General John Pope, whose bluster promised boldness. Pope boasted that his headquarters would be in the saddle. He vowed to march not with caution, but with fire. Lee accepted the challenge. In August, his army swept northward, maneuvering with breathtaking speed. At Second Bull Run, on the same fields where the war's first great battle had been fought, Lee crushed Pope's army. For the North, it was a humiliation. For the South, a triumph. And for Lee, emboldened, it was not enough. He resolved to carry the war beyond Virginia, into Maryland, into Union soil. Antietam, the bloodiest day. Lee's invasion of the North was both strategic and symbolic. Strategically, he sought to relieve war-ravaged Virginia and gather supplies from Maryland's farms. Symbolically, he hoped to win a victory so stunning that Britain and France would recognize the Confederacy as a nation. But fortune betrayed him. A Union soldier, scouting near Frederick, Maryland, discovered a bundle of cigars wrapped in paper. That paper contained Lee's entire campaign plan. Special Order 191. The orders were rushed to McClellan. For once, the cautious general had a priceless gift: the enemy's intentions laid bare. "Here is a paper," he exclaimed, "with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." Yet even with this miracle, McClellan delayed, moving ponderously, giving Lee time to regroup near the little town of Shopsburg by Antietam Creek. On September 17, 1862, the armies collided. What followed was the bloodiest single day in American history. At dawn, Union troops surged into a cornfield. Within minutes, the tall stalks were scythed down, men and plants falling alike, until the field was carpeted with bodies. At mid-morning, fighting shifted to a sunken farm lane. Union assaults poured into its walls until the road became a slaughter pen filled with corpses. It would forever after be called Bloody Lane. By afternoon, Union forces hurled themselves at a stone bridge over Antietam Creek, defended by a handful of Georgians. Wave after wave fell in heaps, until finally, the defenders were overwhelmed. Nightfall ended the carnage. Nearly 23,000 men lay dead, wounded, or missing. Never before had Americans killed one another in such numbers in a single day. Tactically, the battle was a stalemate. But strategically, it was a turning point. Lee's invasion was halted. He retreated back to Virginia. The Confederacy had failed to win its great foreign recognition. And Lincoln saw his chance. Emancipation, a new war. Until Antietam, the war had been fought with a single official aim: the preservation of the Union. Slavery, though its shadow lay over every cause and consequence, had been left untouched. Lincoln knew that to strike at it too soon risked alienating the border states and splintering Northern unity. But now, with Lee repelled, Lincoln judged the moment ripe. On September 22, 1862, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. On January 1, 1863, it would take effect. All slaves in the rebelling states would be thenceforward, and forever free. It was not universal freedom. border states were exempt, and only rebellion-bound regions were targeted. Yet, its meaning was seismic. The war was no longer only about Union. It was about human freedom. Abroad, the effect was decisive. In Britain, where abolitionist sentiment ran deep, recognition of the Confederacy became politically impossible. To support the South was now to support slavery. The Confederacy's last, best hope for foreign intervention slipped away. At home, the effect was equally profound. Thousands of enslaved men, women, and children fled to Union lines. Black regiments began to form. The war for the Union had become, irreversibly, a war for freedom. The shadow deepens, yet victory remained elusive. McClellan, even after Antietam, failed to pursue Lee with vigor. Once more, caution prevailed. Once more, opportunity slipped away. Lincoln, weary of excuses, removed him from command. The Army of the Potomac would march under new generals, Burnside, Hooker, Meade, each with their moment, each with their failures. But for now, in the autumn of 1862, the nation stood transformed. The fields of Antietam were still heavy with the dead, their bodies buried in shallow graves, their names carved in the nation's memory. And over it all hung Lincoln's proclamation, a document both promise and prophecy. The war was entering its darkest passage, but also its most profound. Hell and glory. Winter had descended on Virginia, but the war showed no signs of slumber. The Army of the Potomac, battered, exhausted, yet still vast, took its place across the frost-bitten fields. Across the Rappahannock River, in Fredericksburg, Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia had dug in. From their commanding heights, the Confederates surveyed the approaching Union Army like hunters above the plains, waiting to unleash the storm. General Ambrose Burnside, Lincoln's new choice for command, was determined to redeem the Union honor. He had witnessed the caution of McClellan, understood the public outrage, and was resolved not to repeat past mistakes. Yet Burnside's resolve would collide with the immutable facts of terrain, winter, and Lee's genius. Fredericksburg, a massacre in the snow. On December 11, 1862, Burnside's army began to arrive on the Rappahannock, only to find the pontoon bridges delayed. Every hour's delay allowed Lee to consolidate his defenses atop Mary's Heights, a ridge that loomed over the Union approach. Stone walls, sunken roads, and open fields turned Fredericksburg into a fortress of death. December 13th dawned cold and gray. Burnside ordered the attack. Wave after wave of Union soldiers charged across the frozen, open fields. Behind stone walls, Confederate riflemen and artillerymen rained fire down upon them. Men fell in drifts, the snow turning to a grim crimson. Brigade after brigade was slaughtered, yet the orders never wavered. Burnside, compelled by duty and expectation, pressed on, watching his men cut down like wheat. By sunset, 12,600 Union soldiers lay dead, wounded, or missing. Confederate casualties numbered far fewer, approximately 5,300. The slaughter was almost mythic. Fredericksburg became a testament to courage and an indictment of miscalculated command. For Lee, the victory was monumental. For the Confederacy, it was morale incarnate. But even amidst triumph, Lee was not reckless. The Union Army remained a vast, terrible machine. Lee knew that the war would continue, that the fate of his homeland required more than one triumph. Stones River and the Western Front. While the East burned with the winter's cold, the West remained a theater of equal intensity. In Tennessee, Murfreesboro, or Stones River, as the Union named it, became the stage for one of the war's most vicious engagements. Confederate General Braxton Bragg faced Union General William S. Rosecrans. Between December 31, 1862, and January 2, 1863, artillery roared and men collided in chaos. Confederate forces launched frontal assaults against entrenched Union positions, advancing through mud, rain, and smoke. For each yard gained, hundreds fell. Union artillery blazed like molten iron, tearing the Confederates apart. Despite 13,000 Union casualties, Rosecrans' army remained on the field. Both sides had paid a terrifying price, but the North claimed the psychological victory. In the West, momentum was beginning to shift. Vicksburg and the Mississippi River loomed on the horizon as the key to cutting the Confederacy in two. Chancellorsville, Lee's gambit. Spring of 1863 brought renewal and a new demonstration of Lee's audacity. Facing a numerically superior Union force under General Joseph Hooker, Lee orchestrated what would become known as the Battle of Chancellorsville. Hooker's army, confident after its advance into Virginia, believed itself to have Lee outnumbered. Lee saw opportunity in audacity. Against all conventional military logic, he split his forces, sending Stonewall Jackson with 30,000 men on a flanking march through dense woodland. On May 2, 1863, Jackson struck Hooker's right flank with ferocity. Union lines crumpled. Panic spread as columns of soldiers stumbled over one another, rifles misfiring in the chaos. Hooker's brilliance was shattered, his army driven to the defensive, its cohesion in tatters. But Chancellorsville was not without tragedy. As night fell, Jackson, returning from reconnaissance, was mistakenly shot by his own men. Amputation followed, and days later, he would die of pneumonia. The Confederacy lost one of its greatest commanders, even as it achieved one of its most brilliant victories. Lee had won a tactical miracle, but at a personal and strategic cost that would echo through the South forever. Gettysburg, the turning point. By summer, Lee had regained confidence. The war's momentum, so long held by the Union in the West and by attrition in the East, had tilted toward him. His army moved north into Pennsylvania in a gamble that would change the war's trajectory. Gettysburg. From July 13, 1863, the fields, ridges, and woods of southern Pennsylvania became a crucible of American blood. Infantry clashed across open farmland, artillery pounded hilltops, cavalry skirmished in forests and valleys. Lee sought a decisive blow that would destroy the Union Army and compel Northern capitulation. Little Round Top, Cemetery Ridge, the Wheat Field, and Pickett's Charge, these names would become etched in history. On July 3, Pickett's men advanced across open fields, their line shattered under relentless Union cannon and rifle fire. Of 12,500 men, over half fell. The Confederacy's dream of victory in the North died amid smoke and blood. Gettysburg was the high watermark of the Confederacy. Lee's audacity had brought him to the doorstep of Union soil, yet the Union held, and Lee would retreat to Virginia, battered but unbroken. Vicksburg, the Mississippi Divide. While Gettysburg raged, the West saw its own decisive theater. General Ulysses S. Grant turned his eyes to Vicksburg, Mississippi, the fortress city commanding the Mississippi River. Control of this river meant control of the Confederacy's lifeline. Grant, relentless and unorthodox, executed a campaign of maneuver, siege, and psychological warfare. For 6 weeks, Confederate forces held within Vicksburg's fortifications, enduring bombardments and starvation. Civilians and soldiers alike were pushed to the edge of desperation. On July 4, 1863, the city surrendered. The Mississippi was under Union control, the Confederacy cleaved in two. Grant emerged from the campaign as a national hero, his reputation for determination and audacity cemented. A nation transformed. By mid-1863, the war had entered a new phase. Gettysburg and Vicksburg marked the turning of the tide. The Confederacy, though still defiant, was on the defensive. The Union, bruised and battered, had demonstrated its capacity for recovery and sustained effort. Lincoln, reflecting on the sacrifices, knew that emancipation had given moral purpose to the Union cause. African American troops now filled Union ranks, bringing courage, skill, and resolve to the front lines. The nation's character was being rewritten on blood-soaked fields, in frozen rivers, and in the hearts of men and women who would survive, or would not. The story of 1863 is one of paradox. Triumph and horror coexisted. Heroism and horror intertwined. From Fredericksburg's slaughter to Chancellorsville's brilliance, from Gettysburg's horror to Vicksburg's triumph, the war showed the nation its capacity for both destruction and endurance. And as the smoke cleared over Mississippi and Pennsylvania, one truth became undeniable. The path to Union victory would be paved with sacrifice, with blood, with courage beyond imagining, and with the inexorable drive of history itself.